So what is the Eucharist, and why is it called Eucharist and communion, and how do we receive the Eucharist worthily? All these wonderful questions, right? So the Eucharist is Jesus Christ himself. His body, blood, his soul, and divinity is what we say, right? So in that host, in every single particle of the host, every single droplet of the precious blood, what looks like the wine, is the entirety of who Jesus is. He is fully human. So he's got a body, he's got blood, he's got a soul. And he's also fully God, his divinity. And we receive all of that when we receive the Eucharist. All right? When Jesus first talked about the Eucharist in John chapter 6, in what's called the Bread of Life discourse, the people he was talking to were talking about manna, the miraculous bread in the desert, under the leadership of Moses, that the Israelites ate for 40 years. And they said, God gave our ancestors Moses, what do you give us? All right? And Jesus said, the real bread that comes down from heaven isn't that, it's my flesh for the life of the world. And he went on to say, my flesh is true food, my blood is true drink, and unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you don't have life in you. So it sounds like he was pretty serious about this, right? He thinks we need to gnaw on his flesh, is the words that he uses in the Greek of the New Testament. People were shocked by this. They were scandalized by this. They didn't know what this meant. It sounds like cannibalism, right? It's not cannibalism because the Eucharist is not dead human flesh. The Eucharist is risen, glorified, human and divine flesh in the form of bread and wine, and that's a very different thing, right? But we are spiritually, we are physically consuming God. God comes inside of us, right? If you think about other normal eating, right, we eat salad so that the nutrients in the lettuce will come into our body, right? And that salad that we eat becomes part of us. In the Eucharist, it kind of works the other way. We receive God so that we can become part of God, right? We come into the inner life of the Holy Trinity. That's a big concept, but that's really what's going on, right? We become part of God. We become deified, is a word they use in Eastern Christianity, right? We receive God so we can become as much like God as is possible, right? And so this is why he comes to us in the form of food. He could have come in any form he wanted. He could have been, there could have been a lamb that just appeared on the altar in the middle of Mass every Sunday. There could have been a whirlwind. Could have been a thunderstorm. All these different things that God appears as in the Bible. He chose to come as food so that we could receive him, so that we could be one with him. That's the whole idea of the Eucharist and communion. That's why it's called communion. Communion means union with another. So we have communion with God by receiving him into our bodies. It's called the Eucharist because that's a Greek word for thanksgiving. All right, think about in the Gospels, Jesus takes bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives thanks, and gives it out to people, right? He Eucharists the bread. He gives thanks to God for the bread, and then he passes it out, right? At the Mass, it's an act of thanksgiving, an act of thankful worship of God. And so we call it the Eucharist. In the Old Testament, under King David, there was this sacrifice, the Todah sacrifice, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and it involved bread, right? And so it's a callback to that, this word Eucharist. And so anywhere in the Bible, when you're at Mass and you hear them reading something and it says they gave thanks, that means Eucharist, right? They Eucharisted. It's very likely that when they use that word, they're referring to the Mass. So the Eucharist, communion, kind of refers to this thanksgiving that we give to God because he doesn't just leave us on our own. He wants to make us one with him, right? And so receiving the Eucharist is an incredible moment of intimacy with God, and so we should approach it that way and not just as a sort of common thing. Sometimes people go up to communion and it looks like they're not even thinking about it. Unfortunately, sometimes I do that as well. I'm distracted with my kids and all this sort of stuff. It's important for us to try to receive the Eucharist worthily and reverently, right? And so if you're receiving on the hand, it's making a throne out of your hands and not just kind of haphazardly with your sleeve over your hand, down around your ankles, receiving the host, right? A throne. Present that throne to receive Jesus so you can put him into your mouth. If you're receiving on the tongue, it's presenting your tongue in a way that the priest or the minister can get the host in there. And so they're not trying to work around your teeth and all that kind of thing, right? You want to receive the Eucharist reverently and not make it this complicated interchange. But we also want to make sure that we're in the right spiritual condition to do that. At a bare minimum, that means not having any unconfessed mortal sin on our souls, right? In order for personal intimacy to happen, I can't have grievously wronged you. I can't have done something terribly wrong against you without apologizing about it first, or else we're just kind of pretending. Same sort of thing with communion. If you have deliberately chosen to do some big thing that you know was wrong and you freely chose to do it anyhow, you have to go to confession before you go to communion. It's the way it works in our personal lives. It's the way it works in our spiritual life with the Lord, right? But then each and every time we go to communion, we also want to remind ourselves as we're going up in that line who it is and what we are receiving. We're receiving God, our Creator, into our own bodies. And that should change the way that we walk up that aisle to receive communion, right? We should call to mind who this is, what this is. We should have, little prayers of, God, I want to be one with you. God, I want to be united with you. God, I want to turn away from my sins. God, I just want to be holy. I want to do what you want me to do. I want to be with you in heaven, right? These little build up a little bit of fervor, if you will, for receiving God into our hearts. And if there's a time where you can't receive communion, either because you can't get to Mass, you're at school, you can't go to daily Mass, you'd like to go to Mass, you'd love to receive Jesus, you have committed a mortal sin and you can't get to confession first, you can do something that's called a spiritual communion. Right? You still have to go to confession before you go to communion, but you can do a spiritual communion where you pray in your heart to God, Jesus, I love you, I want to be united with you, I believe you're present in the Eucharist, I can't receive you now sacramentally, so I ask you to come into my heart in the same way spiritually. And that will give you the grace of the Eucharist without receiving the Eucharist. Right? So this is what the Eucharist is. This was God's game plan from the beginning, to be so close to us that he can be even physically united with us in the Eucharist. God's plan was never to be distant. His plan was always to be close, and the Eucharist is the primary way that he gets close to us now.